My name is George Galloway, presenter of كلمة on Mayadeen television. Morning to you. I don't mince my words. I speak كلمة and my audience does too. كلمة free word, free for me, free for you. Catch it. Nice to meet you, brother. Welcome to كلمة with me, George Galloway, on Mayadeen television, coming to you from London and unusually discussing something British. The Prime Minister of Britain, Boris Johnson, is in deep, deep trouble. The proximate reason for the trouble that Boris Johnson is in need not detain us for long, for it is merely a cipher for several other currents that are running through British politics and through the ruling Conservative Party, which has been in power, either in coalition or absolute power, now for 12 years, with at least 2 years still to go before the next general election. That's a long time. Boris Johnson is not what people say he is. He, with his exotic lineage involving the United States, New York, Turkey, Russia, et al., is no kind of traditional British white supremacist. Neither is he, as some on the left claim, maybe even here today, a hard right politician leading a hard right political party and government. As a matter of fact, Boris Johnson is a liberal. As a matter of fact, he's a licentious liberal of the most extreme kind. He's lived his entire life not caring about who he hurt, upset, betrayed, not caring for any difficulties that he, with his own behavior, has led himself into. There are a litany of families of Boris Johnson, not just his own families, but his, how shall I put it, intervention into the lives of other people's families. Champagne, cocaine, cannabis. He has led the life of a 19th century English public schoolboy, a kind of cross between Billy Bunter and Flashman. Look them up if you're not familiar with them. He is a liberal. There is no polar bear he wouldn't hug, no green cause he wouldn't embrace, no gender or sexual cause that he will not hoist the rainbow flag for. So he's not a white supremacist and he's not hard right. In my view, he's not even a conservative at all. And that is one of the problems that he is facing. He's not a conservative at all. On tax and spend, he's spending public money like a drunken sailor with far more abandon than any Labour Chancellor would do. His one saving grace for the right of his party, the Thatcherites in his party, is that after a great deal of equivocation, I mean the night before a great deal of equivocation, came down on the side of Brexit. And unlike his predecessor, Theresa May, actually got Brexit over the line. But that's a wasting asset, especially as he hasn't actually grasped the power that Brexit gives him to strike an independent course in foreign policy, in trade deals. In Latin America, for example, almost all the trade deals remain still to be done. He hasn't grasped the power that is now his, according to Brexit, to deal with the arrival on the southern coasts of England of some 1,000 to 2,000 people every single week, who then go on to be housed indeterminately at a price of £75 per head in hotels for potentially many years to come, maybe even for always. Try getting a hotel in the Midlands or the north of England now. You will not. They're closed for usual business because the profitable business is in the refugees and the asylum seekers. So Boris Johnson is in trouble because he's not conservative enough for some of his fellows, and he's too Brexit for many of the others. Now, he faced a no-confidence motion. He won it, but he didn't win it well, despite all the protestations to the contrary. He had more votes against him as a percentage of his parliamentary party than Theresa May had when she had a vote of no confidence tabled against her, and she was out within 6 months. When I myself was in Parliament with one of the guests here today, John Major triggered his own vote of confidence, and he had fewer people against him than Boris Johnson did recently. And we know what happened to him. In 1997, he went down to a landslide defeat at the hands of soon-to-be Sir Tony Blair. These are my views. I summarise them thus. I believe that Boris Johnson will hold on because his opponents in his own party have no leader and they have no programme. When Mrs Thatcher faced the challenge of Michael Heseltine, although Heseltine didn't eventually win, he was quite obviously a leader. And he had a programme, which was to break from the Thatcherite economic model that his predecessor had fashioned and ruled Britain for a decade with. So without a challenger, without an alternative programme, Boris Johnson is probably here until the next general election. The question is, will he then face the same fate as John Major? I'm joined, as always, with a group of excellent, real experts. I'm just the enthusiastic amateur. And we're looking at what is the future for Boris Johnson, Prime Minister. Robert Olds, you're a well-known spokesman for the Bruges Group, which was a Thatcherite grouping, which was one of the pioneers, I must say, of the struggle for Brexit. I'm imagining that the only thing that attracts you to Boris Johnson is Brexit. Would I be wrong?
Well, Boris Johnson is benefiting at the moment from the fact that there, as you mentioned, there isn't really an obvious choice of a replacement. There isn't an alternative ideology, and Boris Johnson can pretend to be any number of political wings of the party. He will throw red meat to Eurosceptics by promising to do something about Northern Ireland and making sure that's brought back fully into the UK and out of the EU's orbit, or promising to do something about asylum seekers and migrants by having the Rwanda policy. We're deporting people to Rwanda to have their applications processed. He can do things like that, but at the same time, he can present himself to other sort of one nation Tory elements of the Conservative Party by his ambitious tax and spend policies, which, of course, in terms of the state intervention, state expansion of the state, it's as big as it was under Clement Attlee, the socialist Labour Prime Minister after the Second World War, who nationalised much of Britain's industry. So really, Boris is of many different, has many different facets. But of course, as Margaret Thatcher said, if you're going to be in the middle of the road, you're going to be hit from both sides. But I think Boris Johnson does have one eye on the future, and he's very much aligned with globalist instincts. He, of course, is very, despite his Russian ancestry, is very pro-Ukraine, and that's all part of what the current establishment wants to do. And I think he's looking at what's coming next and making a lot of money after he leaves office, just like Tony Blair has done. So I think he's not really backing his self-interest, because if he were to, in terms of for the short term and remaining and being a good prime minister, he would be governing as a conservative, a cultural conservative, rewarding those people in the north of England, for instance, who are Labour supporters, who want something done about immigration, want a real Brexit, and don't want energy costs forced upon them. But he's not. He is running policies that global institutions want to follow, and of course is all part of a big, I would argue, a big corporate scam. And he's happy to go along with that, because that's where probably his future lies. And Mrs. Johnson may be thoroughly in favour of that as well.
Yeah, he'll have to work hard to make as much money as Tony Blair, I've got to say. Jakes Arnold, my former esteemed parliamentary colleague, big interest in Latin America, keen monarchist, a moderate conservative, I would have said, having viewed you up close and personal for a long time. Are you one of those that doesn't like some of the policies being pursued by Boris Johnson, but think he's the best man for the job, at least the best man you've got available at the moment?
I think you summarise that probably quite well. For many of the reasons we've just heard, there needs to be a change of policy course in what's going on. But I have to say, the thing I most admire about Boris is his stamina. He's been our Prime Minister for coming up for 3 years now, and he literally has been under intense pressure with no let-up. He inherited an unruly Remainer Parliament. He managed to get Brexit through. He fought an election and won it with a majority of the likes we haven't seen since you and I were elected. Then gets hit by the pandemic, not only nationally in terms of his office, but in person. It very nearly killed him. He's not had any time for recuperation and convalescence, because he's been straight into how financially he would support the people and businesses in this country. And then to cap it all is Putin's murderous adventure in Ukraine. Boris is a descendant of many countries, but not actually of Russia. But he is supporting Ukraine. Why? Because of his belief and our beliefs in freedom. And the Ukrainian people who are fighting for their freedom against this barbaric attack very much appreciate what he has done. He is leading the free world in fighting back for freedom and giving support to the Ukrainians.
I heard a hoarse laugh off the side of the studio there. I'll not follow you down that road, except to say how profoundly I disagree with it. But he is spending money like a drunken sailor, isn't he? Where is that money coming from?
It is coming from the future through debt. Now,
I'm going to say that to I'm going to go and buy a car and tell the man who's selling the car, this money for this car is coming from the future.
Well, see if you can get away with it. I would just say, if you look at the way we got through the pandemic, why was it immediately afterwards we had an immediate bounce back far bigger than other members of the G7 and so on?
Have you filled your car lately? Have you tried to calibrate your
Let us stick to the point. You asked the question. You asked the question, where's this money coming from? The question that he was faced with is, do you support the British people and businesses to somehow get through this unprecedented plague of COVID that we suffered? That was his problem. Then to be hit with the Ukrainian war and therefore the vast increase in the cost of energy, he has had again to produce a finance to support people under extreme duress and difficulty. Did he necessarily want to do that? Probably not in financial terms, but he, as our Prime Minister, had to weigh it up and what was the highest priority. And both in terms of dealing with COVID and now in terms of dealing with the energy, he's sided with the British people and the determination that we all get through this.
Okay. Hussein Ali Diakids, You are uniquely on this panel a left-wing Muslim community activist, a well-known one, but you're also a historian, a geopolitical analyst, a big supporter of the Palestinian people, and we can admire your handsome kafia, which will be widely cheered by the audience around the Arab world. What's your take on Boris Johnson? And are you one of those that think that the Labour leader, Keir Starmer, deserves to and would be a credit to the position of Prime Minister of Britain?
Okay, I'm probably going to be a bit different, and some of the left, many people on the left might disagree with me on this, but I'm actually terrified of Keir Starmer. I find him, as a Muslim particularly, I find him to be more Islamophobic than Boris in many of his actions. He's done a great cleansing of the party, of the Labour Party, of Muslims, anyone who supports Muslim rights. So to see with Boris, a Tory is a Tory from our point of view. You know, he's going to do things that Tories are going to do, and you're not going to expect much less from him. But when you have someone that the Labour Party or the Muslim community has always put their trust into the Labour Party, blindly often, even after Tony Blair, as much as we disliked Tony Blair, we still voted Labour just because it was the idea of the lesser of two evils. I don't see Keir Starmer as the lesser of two evils anymore. And I think that's the main problem that we have. We have a real vacuum within politics. We've seen that in Tower Hamlets, in the latest local elections.
In the East End of London, my former parliamentary constituency.
Yes. And you, as far as I know, you inspired a lot of the Aspire party in the early days. They took on carried on what you did back then and what you built. And we're seeing as well the Green Party had a bit of a rise, you know, not as much as they could have, but that's mainly due to their own problems within their party. But there is a big vacuum there for left-leaning people, for Muslims, for people who support minority rights that we're not seeing in the Labour Party. We're just seeing, it's been said many times, a Tory light, but to the point now where it does feel like it's become more extreme. Boris might say some controversial things, but does he agree with these things, or is he just trying to get support from traditional Tories? That's the issue that we're having, I think. And so I think right now I would rather Boris stay and wait till Labour has a decent leader who can actually galvanise real Labour support, if that's even possible now with the state.
I think you might get your wish. Now, Sheikh Jafar Ladak is in Leeds in England. He's the Imam of Babul Ilm Centre in Leeds. He's the writer and author of 4 important books. Sheikh, welcome to the show.
My honour. Thank you for inviting me.
Sheikh, you're leading a campaign to change the emphasis of Muslim community charities. In the past, almost all of hundreds of millions of pounds a year was being sent to, if you like, poor countries, many of which the community originally came from. Now you want to spend far more of that money here in Britain. What's the reason for this change of emphasis?
Statistically speaking, the Muslim community is the most generous community in the UK. However, also statistically speaking, the vast majority of those charitable funds that are raised tend to go abroad to those countries that we have come as a refugee or as a diaspora community from. But at the same time, we began to realize that we're not focused on the needs that are immediately in front of our eyes in our own backyards, so to speak. And this, of course, has many effects. Now, in the times in which we're living in, since the time of austerity over the last 12 odd years, many millions of children have been plunged into different levels of poverty. And this is something that is now front page of national newspapers. We're actually seeing, for example, the unions, such as those unions of teachers, those unions of head teachers, describing what they're seeing on a day-to-day basis in their classrooms. When you have a government that has pulled the rug from underneath communities, we knew immediately that we need to focus attention on serving those needs that are immediately in front of us. So we looked at which communities we could support and also charities that we could join. So this was the genesis of what we tried to do over the last couple of years.
So who should be blamed for the situation you describe? Is it Boris Johnson and the government's fault? How did we get into the mess you describe?
The fact of the matter is that the British economy is the fifth, or at least the sixth largest economy in the world. There is no reason as to why the fifth or sixth largest economy in the world should have so many millions of people going hungry or suffering in such a drastic way. That tells us that the problem isn't just Boris Johnson. Of course, his mishandling of the pandemic and the entire Brexit fiasco is well known to everybody. But we're talking about systemic issues here, whereby huge amounts of wealth are being gobbled up by a certain ideology, by a certain class, and the idea of public ownership or the ideas of utilities actually working for the constituents of this country has almost become a joke. There's almost no serious political discourse around these particular issues. And so someone like Boris Johnson or the Conservative Party is a symptom of what the British economy is like today. But actually going back a step to what you asked, when we say who we blame, I think we also have to look inwards as a Muslim community and wider as a British society to ask ourselves, for how long will we tolerate this level of corruption? And how long will we tolerate people in our country going hungry? And it's got to the point now where we can't trust the opposition party to be able to make a serious dent in this. Because, as from my humble purview, when I see the sort of policies that are coming out of the current opposition party, they don't look anywhere as positive or people-centric as what the previous opposition party looked like. And so I really think that there needs to be a step taken back and a real review of the way in which we want this country to look like. And until we actually have those fundamental questions being discussed, I don't imagine anything is going to change in the immediate future. And the proof of the pudding is that in the last several months, we're now being faced with a cost of living crisis. And what has the government done? They have said, for example, that they've cut 5p from the tax, from the duty on fuel at the petrol pumps. In the last 3 months, all we've seen is it continue to rise. It's now reached £2 a litre for unleaded. And that, of course, is just one example.
And finally, Sheikh, what's the solution? You're scathing about Boris Johnson, but equally scathing about the opposition Labour Party. If neither of those, what?
It was obvious before Boris Johnson came in that he was wholly unsuitable for this role. We also find that those people who are going to come after him, they also do not seem to be suitable for this role. We then have to think to ourselves that a political process that is actually concerned with the needs of the people has to start with the concerns of ordinary people and has to have an economy that is rooted in trying to lift people out of poverty systematically. And that needs to be things like affordable housing for everybody as a human right. It needs to be that the utilities are in public ownership and available to everyone at cost. It needs to be that there are a return to freedoms that people used to be able to enjoy. And that includes sort of things like freedom of travel, allowing people to go back and find work around the world in a way that is not restrictive of people's human rights. we have to shift the political theory and the economic theory around these principles. And I believe that's when we will be able to have systematic change.
Much more coming up after the break. Stay tuned. You're watching كلمة with me, George Galloway, on Mayadeen television, coming from London, talking about the man in 10 Downing Street in London, who currently, at least, rules the roost. Not just here, but plays a significant role as the #1 ally of the American president, Joe Biden. Robert Olds, before the break, we heard a sheikh. He was right, wasn't he, that the two parties, you couldn't slip sixpence between the two front benches. They're Tweedledee and Tweedledum, two cheeks of the same backside. This is a grim time to be interested in British politics, isn't it?
Well, it's been an exciting time. They've had Brexit, which has been a great success, a great debate that had lasted for many decades and has finally been resolved, bar a few issues regarding fishing waters, migration, and of course the position of Northern Ireland. But what an exciting debate! And there was the Labour Party, recently led by Jeremy Corbyn, which was offering something very different, but was defeated at the general election of 2019. At this point in time, there is this merging. Boris Johnson is, to a large degree, and a man of and from the media, and really sort of follows the establishment agenda in one sense of what he's often has one eye on what the newspapers will be printing the next day. And if the media call for something, then of course he will put that into action. And Keir Starmer is, again, not too dissimilar. So in that sense, yes, it is very disappointing. But if he were to think that the Labour Party would be a home for Muslim people, when of course the Labour Party is really pro-corporation, against free enterprise.
And killed a million Muslims in Iraq.
Absolutely, and of course is obsessed by woke issues.
Let's hear from Professor Alex Charles, who's a writer and a thinker of note. He's a journalist and a retired University of Winchester professor. Professor, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Professor, how do you see this situation? We have a government under serious pressure, Prime Minister under siege, really, the weakest opposition that in my political lifetime we have ever seen. None of the other parties making a breakthrough either. How did we get into such a sorry pass?
It's difficult, isn't it, George? The United Kingdom currently probably has the weakest government I've known in my lifetime. That's pretty much because we have the worst prime minister that one could imagine. Boris Johnson isn't a warmonger. He's not necessarily even personally financially corrupt. But Boris Johnson is just a person of absolutely zero honesty and zero honour and zero integrity. It is difficult to imagine a worse person to be Prime Minister. Now, Johnson says he has lots of ideas, but of course it's not a Prime Minister's job to have ideas. It's the Prime Minister's job to lead the country, to implement those ideas, to get his party and to get other parties and the country behind him. The UK is in a state of significant economic crisis. This is a really, really bad situation for the UK. It should be a situation in which the opposition parties, and particularly the Labour Party, are able to take advantage of this. But the Labour Party, frankly, has as a leader a man without a lot of charisma, Sir Keir Starmer, a man of great honesty and honour and integrity, but who doesn't really excite the voters very much. And so the Labour Party hasn't really been able to take advantage, as it should, of the absolute collapse of the authority of the government. We're also, of course, in a situation in which the leader of the opposition Labour Party is also currently under investigation by the police for having breached lockdown regulations. He says he hasn't, and he says he will resign if the police disagree with him. I believe he probably will resign. Unfortunately, we have a prime minister who definitely did breach lockdown regulations, who has been found guilty by the police of doing so and who's accepted a police fine, and yet who hasn't resigned.
Well, the Prime Minister has just won a vote of confidence from his parliamentary colleagues. Will he therefore be able to carry on, or will he fall at the hurdles like some of his predecessors did?
Yeah, well, Boris Johnson had the support of 59% of his MPs. That's not a lot. If we compare it to John Major and Margaret Thatcher, they, of course, had a greater level of support. Theresa May had a greater level of support, and she was gone in a matter of months. This is hardly a major vote of confidence when 41% of your MPs have voted against you. That's a bad thing. Remember, of course, if those people voted against him in a general vote of confidence in Parliament, and I'm not saying that they would, but if they did, if they voted the same way, then the government would collapse. This is not good for the country. The majority of members of Parliament do not believe that Boris Johnson should be Prime Minister. It's not a good thing for the country at all. Lots of people ask me, do I think Boris Johnson should be Prime Minister? Well, of course, I don't think he should be Prime Minister, but I want him to stay on as Prime Minister, because Boris Johnson being Prime Minister is the best chance that we have of a Labour government in this country, or a non-Conservative government in this country. Boris Johnson being Prime Minister is fantastic for me as a journalist, because there's so much to write about every week. But no, for the country, it's tragic. It's an embarrassment. Boris Johnson has been embarrassing the country since he became Prime Minister. Indeed, when he was Foreign Secretary, he was an embarrassment to the country. He is a liability for the Conservative Party in terms of their electoral prospects, but he's a real liability for the country and for the world in terms of his inability to show leadership. And he can't show leadership because people don't trust him, and they don't trust him because he is both dishonest and inconsistent. And so what's the point of making a deal with Boris Johnson? Nobody believes he will ever live up to it.
Well, Boris Johnson has won 3 elections against the grain, in the third case, at least the size of the victory. He twice won the mayoralty of London, overwhelmingly Labour city nowadays. And of course, he got a huge parliamentary majority, but 3 years ago. Who on earth have the Conservatives got to replace such a man with?
So, yeah, Boris Johnson has in the past been, if not a great communicator, an amusing communicator. As Mayor of London, he was a figurehead. Not a great decision maker, but a good figurehead. He's quite good for the feel-good factor. He's quite a funny chap. He's very good on TV game shows. He's very amusing. What he isn't is an honest and honourable and trusted leader. The trouble is, of course, that like many weak leaders, he's surrounded himself with some very weak people. And there aren't any obvious people in the British Conservative Party, certainly senior in the Conservative Party, who could take over from him. The Conservative Party's own most preferred candidate is Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary. But Liz Truss is not at all popular in the country. She seems ineffective. She seems, frankly, like an overly enthusiastic schoolgirl in many occasions. She is not a great serious figure. She is not a Margaret Thatcher or a Theresa May. Now, I didn't like Thatcher or Theresa May, but they were serious politicians. Liz Truss doesn't seem like a serious politician. Who else is there? The Deputy Prime Minister, Dominic Raab, the man who spent the Afghan crisis on holiday, didn't come home, and of course the UK evacuation of Afghanistan went horribly wrong, and many people blame Dominic Raab. He was Foreign Secretary at the time. He was then demoted to Justice Secretary, but he insisted on being made Deputy Prime Minister. Dominic Raab is not exactly an intellectual heavyweight, nor indeed is Liz Truss. Having said that, there are some very good people actually in government at the moment, not white, and the Conservative Party is very, very unlikely to vote for a non-white leader. The current Education Secretary, of course, very competent at that, who formerly ran the vaccines campaign in Britain, showed very great confidence at that, I think would be a decent Prime Minister. I don't agree with him ideologically, but I think he'd be a competent Prime Minister. But unfortunately, it's unlikely that the Conservative Party would vote for a person like that. I think the British people would be perfectly happy to vote for a person of colour as Prime Minister. I'm just not convinced that the Conservative Party would do so. And therefore, they're really rather stuck. They've got a load of frankly incompetent and uninspiring white, middle-class, middle-aged people who are most likely to be voted as Tory leader, but who frankly wouldn't make a decent Prime Minister.
Jakes, you were getting hot under the collar there. Why?
Well, he sets up Aunt Sally's. He's not mentioned a number of candidates were there to be election, but we actually have a...
You're welcome to.
We actually have a first-rate in the current Prime Minister.
Well, 41% of the MPs for the Conservatives don't think he's first-rate at all.
Because he has been knocked off course by the unusual, the completely unprecedented case in this for a century of a pandemic of this sort.
But the 41% know that also. You're not the only one who knows that. They have the same information as you. But 41% said they had no confidence in him.
Yes. And I believe that we have seen this before. At the time of Margaret Thatcher in 1990, there was panic by people who should have known better, worried about their seats. Well, what they should be worried about is the country.
She get on after that panic?
And she carried on.
She was toppled.
No, she wasn't toppled. She stood down in order to make sure that we were not succeeded by Michael Heseltine.
Well, that's a very novel interpretation of the history. There was a motion of no confidence, a challenge.
Yes.
She won it, but so many of her colleagues did not support her that she stood down. If Boris Johnson will do the same, Robert, who do you see as papabile? Who could be the next leader of the Conservative Party?
Well, many people were originally hoping that it would be Priti Patel, the current Home Secretary, but since she failed to deal with the immigration on the England's southern coast, her star has fallen. Of course, arguably, it's not her fault. It's because Britain's still tied into EU and EU laws that affect this, and also international agreements which make it difficult to tackle. Rishi Sunak, again a man of Indian origin, was originally touted as being the man that would have succeeded, but of course his star has also fallen since he made a hash of the economy. And is he really suitable? Because he's an ex-Goldman Sachs man, and that for me and for many people would create question marks. Another possible name would have been Safid Javid, but he fell out with Boris some time ago. And another one is Nadeem Zakawi, who's originally of a Kurdish Iraqi background. He might not be high profile enough, but he's a good communicator and he's managed to avoid the trouble a lot of the others caused. So it could be him or Kwasi Kwarteng. So contrary to what the other gentleman mentioned, there are many people, and indeed the most likely successors of Boris Johnson over the recent years are people of various different backgrounds, of either Pakistani heritage or Indian heritage or of African heritage as well, going back in their ancestry. And it's the Conservative Party that would be far more open to that, because it was originally the party that had the first female Prime Minister and regrettably a second female Prime Minister as well, in the form of Theresa May, who was a real disaster. And it's surprising that she wasn't removed sooner and she got as far as she did, but I would argue there was a sort of tokenism behind having her in power, and she was leading the Conservative Party to almost oblivion. It's not as bad as as that for Boris as yet. But really, we can't be sure. What we need is a change of track to get the economy going. That's the most important thing. And Boris can be lent on. He is, in a sense, a blank canvas for other people to write their agenda. We just need to show him the correct way. And that's shameful for a Conservative. So indeed, it's right for him to be punished. But with no obvious successor, it is better that we have course correction. And Boris can, I think, still be persuaded to change, but it does need to be significant.
Don't take your eye off a woman called Penny Mordaunt. I had a small wager on her at odds of 40 to 1. And if she comes in, I'll be partying. Jakes, the last word from you. You are, to my knowledge, a highly moral and upright man. Boris Johnson simply is not. I saw you bridle at the allegation that he was dishonest, but he is provably dishonest all of his life. He was dishonestly having an affair with his now wife when his previous wife was suffering from cancer and going through cancer treatment. He impregnated somebody else's wife, a family that are now bringing up his child that he denied paternity of until having to go to court to submit to his paternity. He is a bounder, a cad. He's a mountebank. In a previous era, he would have been horsewhipped out of public life. Okay. How can a man like you so, I don't know, be so sanguine about these things?
The parliamentary party and the party at large accepted Boris for our leader at the time, fully cognizant of his moral shortcomings. There's no doubt about that. To suggest he's dishonest is a totally different matter. I don't believe he is dishonest.
Previous Mrs. Johnsons would have testified.
You are talking, dishonest. But you're going back not to dishonesty, but to morality. And that is a completely different issue.
Well, what about his girlfriend?
So why
hundreds of thousands of pounds of money?
So why was
when he was mayor?
So why was he selected in the first place for mayor and for prime minister? Basically because he was the person most likely to succeed given what the country and the party wanted, and that was to get the result of the referendum, to get the Brexit policy done. And of course, subsequently, we have had coping with the pandemic, coping with the Ukrainian war. The party's eyes are open. They're aware of his shortcomings in the personal department, but it does not impact on the way he carries out his duties as Prime Minister.
Things have changed then, yeah? Because such a person could not have become Prime Minister. When we were in Parliament.
I'm sure in your time you would have said that to Lloyd George. Unfortunately, with high quality and high enthusiasm does go morality somewhat at the margin. And despite that, the Liberals all the way back in the beginning of the last century settled for Lloyd George, and we settled for Boris Johnson because we needed, the country and the party needed the qualities that he offered at the time. And as we've been told, what the problem really is at the moment is not all this nonsense of partying in number 10, which incidentally was largely because of civil service participation and lack of control. There is no doubt that all this needs to be tackled, and there needs to be changes in policy, particularly as we heard earlier from our colleague here.
Well, there you have it, the spirit that built the empire. Don't you feel proud that we colonized you for so very long? It's been a pleasure conducting this debate, spirited and very divisive this evening. I hope it made for good television. I'm George Galloway. You've been a wonderful audience. This has been كلمة on Al Mayadeen television.